Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Epstein. I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty and Research at the Korbel School of International Studies. I'm here to introduce this Inauguration Day panel, which has a critical question at its core. What can the Biden-Harris administration hope to achieve? Today's inauguration was an historic event, and we are very fortunate to have an extraordinary slate of panelists here to match its importance. I want to start by saying that the Dean of the Korbel School, Fritz Mayer, wishes that he could be here today, but he's recovering extremely well, I should add, from surgery. He's at home right now, but Fritz, if you're listening, we want you to know that we are wishing you well and looking very much forward to your return. I have just a few remarks and observations about today's inauguration event before I introduce our panelists and moderators. First, I probably don't need to point out that it's been an eventful and at times harrowing 2 weeks. It was exactly 2 weeks ago that we witnessed an insurrection at the Capitol. And then precisely a week later, President Trump faced his second impeachment. That was also an historic first. And now today we had the inauguration of a new administration, which unprecedentedly includes a person of color and the first woman as the United States Vice President. Every time a barrier like this one is broken, I feel, justifiably or not, like we are all just at least a little bit more free for the constraining conventions it helps us leave behind. So I know that in a few minutes, our panelists are going to talk about Biden's speech, which is fitting, but I also want to acknowledge the extraordinary poem today by Amanda Gorman. She's the United States Youth Poet Laureate. There were many passages from her poem that I think are destined to become part of the American lexicon. But one phrase that stood out to me particularly was "let love become our legacy," which is so important for this moment. I think it was among the many hopeful, beautiful, and insightful sentiments that she expressed today. Turning now to our panel, I want to point out this is the second time in 2 weeks that the Scrivener Institute of Public Policy at the Korbel School and the Center on American Politics, all of which are at the University of Denver, have teamed up to provide critical commentary on developments in the United States. The last gathering was just 10 days ago. It was organized on very short notice on the storming of the US Capitol. Two University of Denver leaders in this respect are Professors Nazneen Barma and Seth Maskett. Naz Barma is the founding director and chair of the Scrivener Institute of Public Policy. She specializes in peace building, economic development, and global governance, among other subjects. And she's always very insightful on the comparative aspects of American events. Second, Seth Maskett directs the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver. He's also a professor in our political science department here. He focuses on parties, campaigns, and elections in the US. His most recent book is Learning from Loss, about what the Democrats learned, I think both wisely and perhaps less wisely, from 2016, which of course then had effects on fashioning subsequent strategy. Seth, you've probably already thought of this, but I think you should probably write a sequel. I'm wondering what the Republicans are learning right now. Together, Seth and Naz will both participate in the panel and take the lead also in moderating it. Turning now to our other panelists, we have James Kval, who was the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor in the Obama administration, focused on economic opportunity. He's now the president of the Institute for College Access and Success. We also have Julia Azari, Associate Professor in the Political Science Department at Marquette University, specializing in the American presidency and political parties. Julia is a regular contributor to the Center on American Politics, for which we are very grateful. Julia, we welcome you back. We also have our old friend Peter Hansen, who was our colleague here in DU's Political Science Department from 2010 until 2016. He's now an associate professor at Grinnell College and the director of the Grinnell College National Poll. His work focuses on both the US Congress and the politics of the federal budget. Finally, we have with us Susan Schulten, who's a professor of history at the University of Denver and the author of, among other books, A History of America in 100 Maps. Susan is an invaluable resource when it comes to telling us what is new and when really we've seen this all before. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Seth to begin our discussion. And I want to end by just thanking everybody for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that, that wonderful introduction, Rachel. We really appreciate your comments today, your leadership at the university, and really your help with this event. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and especially thank all our panelists for joining us on what is a very busy day and a very busy season. Basically, how this is going to work, I'm going to start off by asking some questions of our various panelists covering their various areas of expertise. After that, we will move on to some of your questions. If you have a question that occurs to you during this conversation, please feel free to type it in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I can't promise we'll get to all of them, but we're certainly going to try. And after we get through this initial round of questions, Naz will be going through your questions and figuring out who's best to answer them. So at any point during this, please feel free to type your question down there. My first question, I'd like to start with Susan Chilton, our historian on this panel. Susan, you have written previously about the presidential transition between James Buchanan and Abraham Lincoln, describing it as among the most dangerous transitions in U.S. history. I think you wrote that before this most recent one, but I'm curious, like, what can past presidential transitions tell us about this one, and what does that sort of tell us about how this administration is likely to go?
Thank you, Seth, and thank you to Dean Epstein for introducing us, and to Professors Barma and Maskett for organizing this event again on such short notice. It's a privilege to be here, and I especially want to join Rachel Epstein in welcoming back Peter Hansen, who was such an admired member of our faculty and beloved by his students. It's great to see you again, Peter. I also want to say what a privilege and a challenge. I know my panelists share this sentiment. It has been to teach in this moment. And it has been incredibly rewarding to live through a period of profound political chaos and to help students think about the present in terms of the past. But as I'll conclude, the past also looks different in light of the present. Now, this unsettled moment that we're living through evokes for me 3 moments of equally severe crisis in our history. And I'm going to highlight those very briefly for you. And I also want to point out that Biden's inaugural address implicitly invoked each one of these 3 past crises. First, in 1801, after a bitterly fought campaign, Thomas Jefferson became the 3rd president of the United States. Now, this was not just a transfer of the office between 2 men, but between 2 parties. In recognizing this defeat, John Adams created a model that would become a cornerstone of our system of representative democracy and set a precedent that would last until this year, and that is the peaceful transition of power. In his inaugural address, Jefferson acknowledged that, quote, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans." He recognized the emergence of these 2 brand new political parties, but also acknowledged that these parties should not obscure the larger institutional structures that bind us together, or the fact of our common citizenship. Biden underscored that point of unity over and over again in his address, even too much so for my students, and we can talk about that. In 1861, the country suffered its gravest political crisis when 7 states decided to leave the Union rather than acknowledge the legitimacy of Abraham Lincoln, who made very clear his opposition to the growth of slavery in the American West. In his first inaugural, Lincoln condemned secession as an anarchistic and violent act that must be defeated. In fact, his defense of the Union was very much a defense of the 1860 election. He called the Union cause, quote, "the people's contest," quote. And what he meant by that was that the people and the electorate have the right to choose their leaders without fear of disunion. Today, we heard Biden say explicitly that this inauguration and this inaugural process was a signal that democracy has prevailed, as he put it. Here he was invoking not just the events of January 6th, but of course, the attitudes that produced that. Now, if 1861 was the gravest political crisis we have ever faced, 1933 was the worst economic crisis. Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in the middle of a terrible and severe period of chaos, where unemployment reached 25%. We saw an accelerating failure of the banks, exploding poverty across the country, and the advent of fascist movements across Europe. After 4 months of waiting since the election, Roosevelt in his inaugural took a very clear and decisive posture. First, he recognized the severity of the situation, something that Herbert Hoover never did, to the full extent that it lived and breathed in every American's situation. As he said, he would treat the economic emergency as if we had been invaded by a foreign power. And it was that moment, the assertion of executive authority, that would launch what we still live with today as one of the most divisive elements of our politics and our ideology. FDR then called on Congress to convene for 100 days to consider a flurry of his proposed legislation to address the economic crisis. Now, we all know none of those early New Deal programs, none of any of the New Deal programs ended the Great Depression, but they did mark a shift, an advent of a new energetic executive form of leadership that we live with to this day. Thousands of Americans wrote to FDR in the days after his inaugural to express how much his words meant to them, the sheer willingness to acknowledge the chaos that was all around him in a way that the incumbent before never would. This morning, we saw Joe Biden similarly assert a level of urgency and face the crisis ahead. Those words alone, I think, set a model for today's inaugural. On a final note, as I began, I just want to observe that the past doesn't always inform the present only, but it's the present that changes our understanding of the past. For me personally, this has been an extraordinarily humbling few months because we have been forced to recognize just how fragile our institutions and our democratic norms really are. The inaugurations of my lifetime have been largely procedural, ceremonial, a lot of pomp and circumstance. We hear the Marine Band and Hail to the Chief. In fact, they're so ceremonial that in recent years, we've seen entertainers like Bruce Springsteen in 2008, and of course today, a few pop stars. Now, the whole idea is that it's largely ceremonial and procedural. The whole idea is to underscore what we have been robbed of, stability and continuity. And the chaos of these past few months reminded us that these scripted and formal affairs are scripted and formal for a reason. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you so much, Susan, for those really thoughtful comments. I really appreciate it. I'd like to go to Julia Azari at this point. Julia, thank you so much for joining us. I know this has been a super busy day for you. You've been up doing 538 live blogging and participating in their chat. We really appreciate you joining us for this. As you're an expert on presidential mandates, on presidential rhetoric, I was curious to know your reaction to the inaugural address today, like rhetorically. What stood out to you? From what you heard today, how do you see Biden seeking to define his presidency, and what can we tell from this about what kind of president he's likely to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a couple of remarks. I should also warn everyone that I've just been on Zoom a whole lot, not just today, but the last few days, and my cat is at the end of her rope, and she really wants to say hello. So I'm not sure what this is going to entail for us, but it may she may make some sort of appearance. Yeah, so I have a couple of reactions to kind of the way in which this day and the inauguration overall, the ceremonies overall, and specifically Biden's speech, but not that, build on what we've inherited from this complicated Trump legacy. And the first thing I want to highlight is more about the ceremony overall, which is that it really struck me that it was not really about Biden. And the people who were highlighted were largely women and people of color, which is the base of the Democratic Party. That there was a lot of talk about Vice President Harris, about her husband as the first first, second gentleman. I'm going to mess that up in every possible way. A lot of emphasis on, this wonderful youth poet laureate. So it was really kind of a celebration of all different kinds of people and the different kinds of people who will be a part of this administration in various ways. It's serving in it, but also serving in Congress as a co-equal branch, people who will contribute as citizens and part of civil society. And that to me has actually been a big theme in the Biden presidency, and something that not only distinguishes Biden from his immediate predecessor, from Trump, whose presidency, I think, over time became more and more personalistic, but it also distinguishes Biden from the president under whom he served. Obama also was, much more of a kind of personal focal point as president. And I think that by necessity, the Biden presidency will move in a different direction. I think that was really evident in the kind of arrangement of the ceremony and the visual rhetoric and the different speakers. The second thing I want to emphasize is that I think one of the big themes of the Trump presidency is the rendering of the invisible visible. All of these kinds of questions about the fragility of democracy and the fragility of democratic institutions they're not completely foreign to those of us who study this stuff, right? They're not completely out of the question, but they're largely invisible, right? We don't talk about things like the peaceful transfer of power. We take these ideas for granted, and that simply has not been possible under the Trump administration, and particularly not in the last 2.5 months. And I think that we'll continue to kind of see this theme of talking about these underlying systems, these underlying kinds of fragile structures as we go through into the Biden presidency. Systemic racism is another point there, where obviously this is not invisible to millions of Americans, but for a lot of people, we did kind of come up in this world of colorblindness, and this idea that racism was a thing of the past, or is like a particular thing for certain bad apples. And Biden has been really vocal since his election about using this phrase systemic racism, that wasn't really part of the mainstream political lexicon until recently. And so I think this all fits Biden's political persona really well, because he has this kind of no nonsense shtick that he had as vice president also. And I think it works well. He's kind of quiet in his rhetorical style compared with someone like Obama, but just sort of has this persona of I will tell it like it is, and that makes him actually a very good spokesperson for these sorts of invisibilities that have been rendered visible. The big question everyone's going to be talking about with regard to Biden's address is going to be this question of unity. We're going to hear a lot of questions about what does unity mean? Is unity possible? And I think there's a very specific way that we should understand that word in a political context and in an inaugural address context. And that is that unity is a code word for purpose. When Biden talks about unity, he's not talking about unifying with everybody that we can possibly imagine, right? He's not talking about unifying with everyone in the entire world. He's talking about forging a meaningful unity with people who share democratic ideals, even as they disagree about policy, even as they disagree about means, that we have some kind of foundation and some kind of consensus. And I think in the rest of the speech, Biden defined what that meaning would be, that if you want to be at the table, you want to pursue power in this system, that you can't be someone who spreads lies and disinformation. Lies and disinformation are antithetical to democracy, and that can't be part of the conversation. You can have many different ideas, background, whatever, policy preferences, but you can't bring lies. And you can't bring hatred, and you can't bring racism. And these are all easier said than done, right? And figuring out who gets to be the arbiter of what counts, that's where the politics comes in. But this is another, I think, kind of thing that Americans have been historically somewhat resistant to, is figuring out what can and can't be in our mainstream political discourse. And I think for a long time, we kind of assumed that if we have people with these anti-democratic or xenophobic or white nationalist ideals, and they're sort of lurking at the fringes, and we sort of let them, do their thing in obscurity, well, their thing is not obscure anymore. And so it needs to be said Those ideas can't be part of the conversation among people who are seeking access to power. And that's where I kind of see not just Biden's rhetoric being, not just his emphasis on unity being about delineating who's in that circle, but also this idea of purpose I see kind of reflected in the discussion of the Emancipation Proclamation. And Seth, who was on the live blog with me this morning, knows that I'm sort of been obsessed with this now for like 5 hours. And I did a quick search. I don't think any president has ever talked about the Emancipation Proclamation in an inaugural before. And that, which makes sense. Inaugurals aren't usually that specific. And the Emancipation Proclamation is kind of not the most soaring moment, right? It's the 13th Amendment is the really soaring moment of wholesale elimination of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation is an executive order. It has no rhetorical flourish. It's an administrative piece of administrative language, freeing the slaves in the Confederacy. It was criticized at the time for essentially freeing the slaves where Lincoln didn't have control and not freeing them in the areas where he did. It did many things. Again, it was an act of war, but one of the things that it did was it was the beginning of infusing the Civil War with that purpose, using the limited powers of the presidency to infuse the Civil War with the purpose of eliminating slavery, something that the Union and that Lincoln's own Republican Party had been very split on, and very kind of back and forth on whether the purpose of the Civil War was to preserve the Union or really whether it was to end slavery. And the Emancipation Proclamation eliminated that doubt. So I think that really was, in a way, kind of reference to the idea that when we take stances in politics, when we pick these powerful words, we're talking about purpose. We're talking about defining a political community that does have shared values that not only are broad and inclusive, but that also have some bright lines around them. And that's what I saw out of Biden's address. I think that does set the tone for his presidency to ask other people in politics to make hard choices. And for some people in DC, this is a hard choice because they're responding to those political forces that have become anti-democratic. But I think this is the beginning of that. I'm hesitant to answer your final question, Seth, about what does this say about what kind of president Biden will be. I think he'll be honest about addressing these difficulties. But I also think that it means that, I don't know that it means everything. I think we see a lot of things on Inauguration Day that are ceremonial and that are insulated from other types of political forces. So it's, I'm not as, super starry-eyed going forward, but I think this is ultimately the tone that's been set.
Thank you so much for those comments. I want to thank you especially for defining unity. Honestly, that was, I think, really absent in a lot of this morning's coverage. So that was particularly helpful there. I would like to turn to Peter Hansen for the next one, my former office mate. Peter, thank you so much for joining us here in Denver, at least virtually for an hour. I wanted to ask you, particularly with your expertise on Congress, Biden comes into office, like most modern presidents, with a unified Congress of his own party, but in his case with very slender margins, basically the narrowest possible margin in the US Senate. I'm curious what your impression is. What are realistic goals for Biden in dealing with Congress? What is he likely to get done? What's likely to be his biggest headache? And if you wouldn't mind just getting into it a little bit, how do you actually run a 50-50 Senate?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's just a real pleasure to see old friends, and I really wish I could be there in person because I miss University of Denver and I miss you, and it's just really good to be here today. Seth, I want to start with the last part of your question on the 50-50 Senate. As some of you may know, I started my career actually working in the US Senate for Senate Democratic Leader Tom Daschle, and was there during the last time we had a 50-50 Senate, which was after the 2000 election. And the procedure is relatively straightforward. and that is that at the beginning of every Senate, the Senate has to adopt an organizing resolution, and that organizing resolution specifies how senators will be divided up on committees and what the ratio between the two parties will be. Now, the agreement worked out between Tom Daschle and Trent Lott, at time the Republican leader, is the model that the current Senate leaders appear to be using. What that means is that there is likely to be, that the committees will be evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, but since Vice President Harris will be the tie-breaking vote in the chamber, Democrats will formally chair the committees and have agenda control over the Senate floor. That agenda control is crucial, of course. It means that Democrats can get their legislative priorities out of committee and their nominations out of committee. I think our best illustration of the importance of controlling the agenda and controlling the committees would be the nomination of the Supreme Court to the Supreme Court of Merrick Garland. You'll recall that he was never given a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee. His nomination was never reported to the floor. And that was despite the fact that he appeared to have the votes in the Senate for his nomination to be approved if Republicans would have let that come to a vote. Now, the one thing holding up this organizing resolution right now is Senator McConnell has asked for a, quote, handshake agreement that the Democrats will not seek to abolish the filibuster on legislation as his price for moving this quickly. Now, he's got some leverage here, and the leverage is that until this new resolution is adopted, the old one remains in force, which gives Republicans the majority on some committees. Of course, there's been some turnover, so committees are missing members right now. There's going to be a lot of pressure on Chuck Schumer, the incoming majority leader, to cut some kind of deal with McConnell here. And the reason is that the Biden administration wants to get moving on its nominations quickly. It wants to have its major cabinet appointments approved. And Schumer wants to do that as well. So this is not something they can delay on indefinitely. I think Mitch McConnell is counting on that pressure on Schumer to get things moving, to get him to cut a deal. Now, the rest of your question, what do the prospects look like for Joe Biden dealing with Congress? Of course, he has a Democratic majority in both chambers. It's very, very narrow. The key thing that gives him is agenda control, as I mentioned before, the ability to get Democratic priorities onto the floor. But I think there's going to be a lot of attention on the US Senate. Of course, the filibuster is still operative in the Senate on legislation, not against things like judicial nominees. And what that means is Biden's really going to have two questions. The first is, what can he get done with a simple majority in the Senate? And what can he only get done with 60 votes, which is the number of votes you need to break a filibuster? There's a lot that can get done with a simple majority. The most important of that would be executive branch nominations, nominations to the judiciary. I've already seen some US federal judges indicating that they'll be stepping down from their posts now that we have a new president. I'm guessing there's going to be immense pressure on Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who is in his 80s, to retire so that he can be replaced by President Biden. And the other thing you can get done in the Senate with a simple majority is what's known as a budget reconciliation bill. Now, these are important. They can carry a lot of legislation, but there are limits on them. That legislation has to affect federal revenues. You can't just pass anything. But I do think we'll see Democrats looking to characterize as much of their agenda as they can as part of the reconciliation process so it can avoid a filibuster. But that still means there are major priorities like climate change, for example, that really can't go through that process. It's going to be very difficult to imagine seeing those kinds of bills move in the current Senate. That said, there are still things that can get done. You'll recall that under President Trump, criminal justice reform was adopted by the Senate that passed that 60-vote hurdle. Jim Curry and Francis Lee have written extensively about the fact that even in these highly polarized times, there are items that don't fall on our standard partisan fault lines that still get done, and they're items of major importance, just like criminal justice reform. One final word on the filibuster is, and I'll turn things back over to you, Seth. There's a major difference between the Senate today and in 2000, which is the last time we had a 50-50 Senate. The Senate is much more polarized now than it was then. But key members of the Democratic caucus are still quite moderate. And Joe Manchin of West Virginia, I think, is the #1 example of that. He comes from a state that voted for Donald Trump overwhelmingly, as does John Tester, senator from Montana. We'll see a lot of focus on those senators as being pivotal members on the Democratic side, who will be determining whether or not the Democrats can get 50 votes for a measure or not. The other thing I just want to draw your attention to is how hard the task is after securing Democratic votes to secure additional Republican votes. The ideological gap between somebody like Joe Manchin and Susan Collins is significant, but not enormous. But once you get beyond that very small group of Republican moderates, there is an enormous ideological gap between them and the rest of the Republican conference in the Senate. So simply trying to round up those additional Republican votes for legislation is going to be extremely difficult. What that's going to do, of course, is put enormous pressure on Senate Democrats to abolish the filibuster so they can take on some of their more pressing legislative items that just really stand no chance of getting 60 votes in the Senate as it's currently configured. It's not clear the Democrats have the votes for that right now. Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, has said he's not willing to entertain that. And so I think one of the dynamics we're going to see playing out over the next 2 years is a growing pressure on people like Manchin to take a stand against the filibuster so that the Democrats can pursue some of these other policies.
Thanks so much, Peter. That was really helpful. I want to turn to James Quall at this point. James, we actually haven't met before today, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I was hoping to ask, from your work within the Obama White House, my assumption is you have some sense of Joe Biden's priorities, his work style. I'd like to get a sense from you, if you could, like, how will Biden likely be different from Obama in terms of his leadership, in terms of his priorities? What range of policies do you see him making progress on in the first 100 days or the first 2 years? And also, more pointedly, are there mistakes you think Obama made that Biden would try to avoid?
Thanks, Seth. Thanks for having me. I really appreciated the opportunity to hear the insightful comments that the earlier panelists have made. Learning a lot here. I do think that one thing that was striking about the speech this morning was the overwhelming focus on bringing the country back together again. And going back to the Democratic Convention, the president has been talking about these 4 crises that are facing our country. There is of course, the crisis of the pandemic, the crisis of the economic recession caused by the pandemic, the crisis of climate change, and the crisis of racial equity. And those 4 themes are being used by the administration to shape their policy agenda and to set priorities. And yet today, the speech really focused on perhaps a 5th crisis, which is a crisis of democratic legitimacy, perhaps an offshoot of the crisis related to racial equity. And although if you listen to his speech, you would know that the United States was in a pandemic and that there were these other problems that needed to solve. Without question, the focus was on how do we bring the country back together again. And I imagine, without having talked to the core team, that it must be a little bit disorienting for them. Just a little over 2 weeks ago, I would say the culture in Washington in November was excessively optimistic about retaking the Senate. Running up to the special elections, it was excessively pessimistic. And I think people were not sincerely expecting or planning for the possibilities of a 50-50 Senate. And On top of that, you have this question now of all the turmoil in the Republican Party. And are we back to the days when Republicans saw passing legislation as a zero-sum game and blocking legislation as a political victory? Or do some now feel, as President Obama said long ago, the fever has broken. It's time to get back to the business of governing here. And do we have a break in that? And so I think those questions will really inform the viability of the legislation. And, I certainly endorse Peter's comments. He laid it out better than I could have. But I would emphasize that even if you are trying to do something that requires a simple majority vote, that is very, very challenging when all you have is a bare majority. And it is indeed the moderates that he mentioned, but any senator could hold up any bill for any reason to demand any policy concession. It makes it extremely difficult to get things through the Senate. And which isn't to say that you wouldn't prefer the bare majority to being in the minority, but there is an element there of accountability and responsibility and perception of being in charge, where in fact you are dramatically hamstrung. And I think that will be, a real headache for the administration and for Senator Schumer. Coming out of the box, I think one thing that is interesting, well, a couple things that might be interesting and different to your question, Seth. I think that President Biden has a much more visceral style. I think he's very in touch with regular people. He thinks about issues in terms of the people he's met rather than a little more academic or intellectual approach from President Obama. I think both are sincere about trying to reach across the aisle and bring people together. Whether a difference between the two men or a difference between the time, I think the Biden administration is much more inclusive in its staffing. And of course, there's been a lot of headlines to the demographic diversity of the cabinet picks. But I think if you dig down into the staffing, you will see diversity, not just by race and gender, but also by ideological orientation. There's a lot more different perspectives in the party that will have a seat within the Biden administration. And then I guess the last point I might make is, the Obama administration really prioritized legislation. And I think many of us remember, the weeks going by hoping for a bipartisan deal on healthcare, wondering if that were going to arrive. The strategy of taking aggressive actions within the president's authority, really did not arrive until the second term, when it became clear the extent of the gridlock. In part because there was a fear that acting aggressively on executive authority would further alienate Congress and make it more difficult to get those important things done. It seems clear that President Biden has made a different judgment, and with the, I think, 19 executive actions he's taking today, with more expected tomorrow, more Friday, he's trying to project a sense of momentum, trying to show people that we can solve problems, that it's a new day here. So his strategy is not wait for legislation first, but let's try and move as quickly as possible on both tracks.
Thanks so much for that. Okay, Naz, I have a question for you about foreign policy. I was actually combing through Biden's inaugural address, looking for his foreign policy content. I came up with, I think, 4 sentences. I think he said, "We will repair our alliances, engage with the world once again, not to meet yesterday's challenges, but today and tomorrow's challenges, and we'll lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. We'll be a strong and trusted partner for peace, progress, and security." I think that was it. So I was actually curious to get your impression. what do you see as likely shifts in American foreign policy as we shift presidential administrations? Either from what we saw, what you heard today, or have there been other moments in either in Biden's professional career or in his campaign that will signal there are important foreign policy shifts coming?
Thanks for that question, Seth. And before I answer it, I just also like to extend my thanks to all of our panelists. I've learned a tremendous amount today, as I did from our panel a couple of weeks ago. I also wanted to invite our audience to please submit questions via the Q&A function. After I wrap up, I'm going to ask Seth a question, and then we're going to turn to our audience questions. So please do send us any questions that you might have. So turning to your question, Seth, I think I would start by observing that we'd be hard pressed to name a new president with more foreign policy experience than Joe Biden. I mean, the one other person with that much foreign policy experience might have been George H.W. Bush. Biden was, of course, a long-term chair and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was intimately involved in the foreign policy decisions of the Obama administration. Indeed, part of his appeal as vice president was his deep foreign policy experience, in contrast to the then foreign policy rookie, Barack Obama. And I would also add that President Biden is deeply interconnected with the Democratic foreign policy establishment, as we can see in all of his top-level appointment nominations. This is a man with a worldview, a perspective on foreign policy. And to pick up on a point that James made just a few minutes ago, the personal relationships around the world, not just in the capital, but around the world, to build on his perspective. He's about to sign, as we speak, if he hasn't already, a couple of first-day executive orders that signal placing foreign policy at the forefront of his agenda. He's going to bring the United States back into the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think in two other enormously important signals to the world, rescind the Trump administration's so-called Muslim ban on travel to the US, and halt construction of the southern border wall. So all that said, I would also note that President Biden's worldview, as many foreign policy analysts have commented in the last couple of weeks, is really one grounded in his experience and in his real world context. He's not somebody who has a sort of a committed ideology or ism. His worldview is rooted in context instead of a view on grand strategy. And I think what his instincts point to, from what we've seen from him over the course of his storied career in foreign policy, is a commitment to multilateral liberalism, one that is grounded in international institutions. So we're going to see very quickly pledges to recommit to the NATO alliance, to the Paris Agreement, as I just mentioned a minute ago, to the World Health Organization, which the Trump administration suspended our ties with. And along with that recommitment to them, promises to actually fulfill our responsibilities to them. I think we are also going to see a big push on the global existential threat that climate change poses. Seth, that was the one sentence in the speech that I kind of caught as I was combing through it that you didn't have in your remarks just a minute ago. He spoke in his speech of the cry for survival coming from the planet. And I think that was very telling. This is something that he has long said is going to be one of his major pillars. Signaled also by the appointment of John Kerry as climate czar, the importance of his commitment to climate change as a global challenge. I think we're also going to see, though I've been talking sort of on the idealistic side of things, I think we're going to see some of this multilateral idealism tempered by a more realistic assessment of American capabilities and interests in now what is the third decade of the 21st century. I don't think we're going to see a classic swing from Trump's isolationism and transactionalism into a new form of internationalism per se. Biden has inherited the late Obama era challenge of recasting the American role in the world. And that's where some of the words that you pointed to in his speech, I think, are very telling. We're going to see, in particular, a kind of a rebalancing, I think, of how American assets and interests are kind of captured and positioned around the world. So, for example, in the Middle East, I think we're going to see the Biden administration in some ways continuing the Trump administration's policy of retrenchment, with a difference perhaps on the Biden side of continuing to make good on certain commitments, for example, to the Afghan government of Ashraf Ghani as the peace deal with the Taliban unfolds. Biden is going to reverse, I think almost certainly many aspects of Trump's Iran policy, such as it was. He will, if possible, rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. the JPCOA. But it might be in the Middle East, and I'll be interested to hear in Q&A whether anybody else sees this, that we see the effects of pressure from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to rein in defense spending and demilitarize American foreign policy. So there are clear signals, for example, that President Biden plans to end US support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. So the big sort of elephant in the room, as it were, is China. I think we're going to see quite a reversal there from the Trump administration's hostility towards China, less of a poking of the beast in some ways. Perhaps a general instinct to find common ground, but not the optimism of Bill Clinton's engagement policy or even George W. Bush's goal of making China a responsible stakeholder in the international system. I think we're going to see a realism there, as signaled by some of the appointments that he has made, while maintaining red lines, for example, on human rights, the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the growing crackdown in Hong Kong, and so on. Let me also add, I think we'll see some sign of reconciliation on the trade front with China. And there, I think that'll be embedded in a revitalized trade agenda in the Indo-Pacific more broadly that looks a lot like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Obama administration worked so hard on and advocated for so strongly and was jettisoned by Trump in its early days. What's interesting about the TPP is that it's not your sort of standard 1960s or 1970s trade liberalization deal. It represents, in its attention to things like intellectual property rights, labor rights, even action on the climate, a way to square the circle between the desire to sort of bind together the Indo-Pacific with the US and counter China, while still staying true to the Build Back Better agenda of focusing on greater economic self-sufficiency at home. And let me just end with just a couple of words on democracy, which of course is going to be a unifying theme across all this. Again, picking up on what others have said. Biden has, for example, pledged to convene a democracy summit to bring together like-minded countries to rescue and resuscitate global democracy. But I think given the events of the last few months, from Trump's insistence on undermining the results of the election to the insurrection itself at the Capitol 2 weeks ago, I think there are real signs that early Biden administration moves on the global democracy agenda will have to come from within. As a couple of my colleagues at Bridging the Gap, Jim Goldgeier and Bruce Gentleson have argued, we need to grapple with the state of democracy at home before we can credibly make the case for our leadership on this issue globally. On the other hand, though, I think, as others have emphasized, a real attempt to share our own democratic struggles and our efforts to restore and strengthen it at home could make us an even more effective ally and advocate on these issues abroad. And so too will putting at the forefront of the policy agenda, foreign policy agenda, a commitment to things like progress on race, on gender, on LGBTQ rights, and so on. The last thing I will say there is that I think what you saw in Biden's speech, and again in the words that you read to us in your question, Seth, this is an administration that believes in U.S. leadership, certainly to pursue the U.S. national interest, but also, as he said in his speech, we can make America once again the leading force for good in the world. Sorry, that was actually the Secretary of State nominee Tony Blinken's words in his Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing. But I think what that represents is the abiding belief in the Biden team that the world is better off in the long run if the United States of America is actively trying to make it so.
Thanks so much, Naz. Did you want to go over to your part at this point, or okay?
Yes, and somebody's calling me to protest what I just said there. I apologize.
Okay.
Thank you, Seth. And I'm actually going to start with a question to you. What can we expect to see from the GOP, both vis-a-vis the Democrats and also within the party itself? And I would just kind of reflect that we saw a big show of unity and comity from the GOP today, which was a relief to see. Will we see them playing ball with the administration or digging in from day one? And sort of secondarily, what are the prospects that the GOP might actually break up into two parties or see a threat from a third party forming?
Thanks so much for that. This is a question I've been struggling with a lot over the last few weeks. I would say my impression is there is a significant split within the Republican Party right now. I agree with you that it was very encouraging to see so much participation by the Republican Party in today's ceremonies. You know, other than President Trump, the vice president was there. A lot of President Trump's strong supporters in Congress were there. But I would note it was just 2 weeks ago, we saw more than half of House Republicans voting basically to overturn the presidential election. And those votes were after the insurrection. I would also note, if you look at the split within, House Republicans on the very election questions, it's not really an ideological split. This is not really about moderates versus conservatives. Here in Colorado, we had a split just between Lauren Boebert in the 3rd district and Ken Buck in the 4th district. Those two are both very conservative. They have very conservative voting records. But Boebert voted to overturn the election, and Buck said, no, we need to move on and get on to the Biden administration, start dealing with that. Today's split, I would say superficially, it seems like Trump versus non-Trump Republicans. I think more deeply, it's about commitment to democracy. It's about a willingness to accept election outcomes you don't like. That's actually in some ways, it's a very scary debate for a party to be having, when it's one of the two parties within a democracy. And it is, the outcome of that is actually going to be very important for the success of this country. I would say even if the Republicans ultimately decide to more or less cast Trump aside and move on from him, I would note that even before Trump's presidency, the Republicans were not really playing ball with Obama all that much. There were government shutdowns. There was a threat to harm the U.S. credit rating. There was, in 2013, there was Ted Cruz's filibuster speech to kill Obamacare. There was a lot of filibuster use. And there, of course, in 2016 was the refusal to seat a Supreme Court nominee. Now, there's been some talk recently about, could we see an actual split into two separate parties? President Trump has floated some idea of forming a Patriot Party and pulling off some of his more loyal people into that. My guess is that doesn't really happen. In some ways, the ingredients are there for a major split within that party, but at the same time, they were also there in 2016. When you saw the party nominate for president, someone a lot of the party's leadership said would be a really bad idea to nominate. They ultimately just rallied behind him and dealt with that. So in some ways, it seems like the price of splitting a party at the presidential level is one they just see as too high, and they're not likely to do it. But of course, we'll know more soon. Okay, I'm going to step back and pass questions on to others.
Thank you, Seth. That was an encouraging response in some ways. I'm sort of going to ask each panelist a question or a sort of paired couple of questions that build on a number of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So I hope that we'll touch on many of the fantastic questions that have come in here. I'm going to start with Susan. And Susan, I'd like to ask you about the sort of silence today that was throughout the proceedings of the day, which was Donald Trump. After dominating our collective psyches for the last 4 years through the sheer force of his will, he was really someone who was non-existent today in the proceedings in many ways, a studied silence that spoke volumes. Was that a good choice on the part of the administration and on the part of all of the people involved? And are there precedents for this? How might it backfire?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer whether it was a good choice because I'm a historian, but I can tell you what the precedents are here. John Adams finally recognized Thomas Jefferson's victory in 1801, but decided to leave Washington rather than to be there for the swearing in. And oddly, his son, John Quincy, made the same decision to leave in 1829 rather than to be there when his rival, Andrew Jackson, was sworn in. Andrew Johnson decided not to attend Ulysses Grant's swearing in 1869. But across the 20th century, we've had what my colleagues very rightly call a culture and a norm. It's my conversations with Greg Kvisted and Josh Wilson in political science that have really taught me how much of this is built over time and how important what Julia calls the invisible structures, right, that now we are talking about very explicitly. And I want to use that to pivot to a question that Doug Scrivener has asked. And thank you, Doug, for making this very panel possible in your generous philanthropy. But Doug Scrivener is right. Our institutions aren't fragile. And I think I may have misspoke there so much as we're now paying renewed attention to them. And I wonder, my own experience as a historian in the last few months has been really remarkable. I cannot believe the level of public interest in history and civics. And I will put that hat on just for a moment. And I wonder, I know this is a little bit aspirational, but whether we're looking at a kind of Sputnik moment for recognizing the power of our institutions on not just in 7th grade civics, but also throughout our adult life, right? To really have a renewed understanding of what is there in that Constitution that we take so much for granted. So I'll stop there, Naz, but that's a kind of answer.
Thank you, Susan, again for a hopeful reflection there. Julie, I'm going to turn to you. There's a couple of questions in the chat, and I am also curious about this myself, of what you think Biden's prospects are for holding together the Democratic coalition. And in particular, what do you see as the most pressing progressive demands that the administration will really find itself having to respond to? Julia, you're muted.
Of course I am. Sorry about that. So this is a great question. I think there's a couple things going on here. The first thing I want to point out is that I think that the looming specter of kind of partisan conflict and of the 2016 election outcome may kind of be part of the Democratic conversation for a long time. This is obviously the topic of Seth's recent book about the Democrats in 2016. But I see that as kind of potentially unifying for a long time. And the idea of splintering as being kind of the real risks of that being really evident to different members of the Democratic coalition. I see Biden also kind of looking at the Democratic coalition as almost in a kind of old school party sense of there's these pieces, what kinds of things do we give each piece? And in that sense, if the progressive part of the Democratic Party sees themselves primarily in the role of moving the overall Democratic agenda to the left and the overall national agenda to the left, then I see a number of things that might be, that might be satisfying to them. On the other hand, if the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, as I've written a little bit about this and suspected this in other contexts, really their ultimate project is to transform the Democratic Party into a kind of fundamental party of the left and Labor Party, they, I think, will have a harder time shoehorning that into what the Democratic Party actually is and what its heritage is, which is this very kind of clunky coalition. That's not to say that either of those are illegitimate goals. It's just they're kind of different. If the goal is to move the Democratic Party to the left, particularly on economic issues and particularly on the questions of enforcement of existing regulations or tightening of rules, I think you're already seeing some of the ways in which Biden has expressed the commitment to listening to this wing of the party in his appointments. In particular, his appointments for the Consumer Protection Bureau. I'm now butchering its name, and I'm just not going to try. I'm sorry. But so Elizabeth Warren's creation, right? He appointed one of her strong allies to head that office to actually enforce some of the existing rules. We also see a progressive voice at Health and Human Services. I know this was very controversial on the left, but the appointment of Neera Tanden for Office of Management and Budget out of the Center for American Progress, she has sort of fallen out of favor with I think the more vocal online left, but is a sort of clear economically progressive voice. And those kinds of appointments will be important even as we deal with the more challenging legislative situation that Peter mentioned. The final thing I'll note is I think there will be several different kinds of policies that the Biden administration will look to in terms of having progressive policy priorities. And those will be policies that are already popular. So the minimum wage falls in that category. So you have policies that are already popular. We have policies that have yet to really be publicly defined, and that the administration thinks perhaps that they can get the edge and be the first mover on defining. And the third category is policies, I think, where they can depict, they can define a narrative in which the bad guy in these policy changes is someone that might be sympathetic to some people in the Republican electorate as well. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about some of the reforms around student loans, some of the ways of enforcing things against the business community. If people truly are unhappy about economic inequality. They're resentful toward economic elites. They're resentful toward what they see as corruption and collusion between governing and economic elites. I think that some of those sentiments are bipartisan. And to the degree that that kind of anti-institutionalist populism can be captured and can even become bipartisan at the margins, I think those will be the kind of policies that the administration will prioritize.
Thank you, Julia. Really kind of clear-sighted, and again, sort of optimistic in terms of what might transpire. I'm going to pretend I'm in class and say that this conversation is worth continuing for 5 more minutes, if everybody will humor me. I'd like to just ask Peter and James just a couple quick questions, and maybe just a minute or two in response so that we can wrap up. Peter, you talked in your comments about some of the progress that can be made legislatively, even in these polarized times. And we had a question in the Q&A about how locked in the GOP's ideological stances are structurally, and by that I mean how much of a role has gerrymandering played. On the flip side, what has to happen for the GOP, the core of the party, to move itself back to the center? This touches on some of what Seth talked about earlier, but we'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Sure, thanks. I'll be brief here. I mean, first, I just want to stress that we can't turn to gerrymandering, I think, is the major explanation for what we're seeing on the Republican side. I mean, the Senate, of course, is state-based, it's not gerrymandered, and senators are highly conservative and ideological as well. On the House side, I guess what I'd say is that gerrymandering overlays, I think, another structural constraint on House districts that really already exists because of geographic differences. So just a quick illustration of this. You can draw the world's greatest district around the city of Denver, and it's going to be 80% Democratic because that's just the city of Denver, right? Similarly, if you just draw urban and rural districts, you're going to get districts that are highly partisan and ideologically lopsided because we have an urban-rural political divide in the United States. So gerrymandering can, I think, exacerbate some of those differences, but it's not the cause of those differences. And I think we need to be careful about that argument. This other question, what needs to happen to move the GOP back to the center? I've given a lot of thought to that. I don't have a great answer. I think that's a puzzle that a lot of us are trying to figure out based upon at least what I view as a general radicalization of the Republican Party. The last time we were this polarized, was at the end of the 19th century. It did end, but it ended really, I think, because of the destruction of the Republican Party in the South after Reconstruction and the capture of that region by segregationist Democrats, leading to a Democratic Party that was an ideological hodgepodge of Southern segregationists and Northern liberals. So we don't really have, a historic model we can turn to for how we can end this cycle of polarization. And I just think that's a continuing project moving forward.
Thank you, Peter. In some ways, we're on the cusp of potentially big transformations. James, I'm going to throw the final question to you, and then Seth will close out the panel. What are we going to consider success in 100 days and in 1,000 days, the traditional sort of metrics here?
Yeah, 100 days, so fast. That is so fast. I'm not sure what we'll know in 100 days, but I think, I think the first big thing to get through here will be the impeachment trial, and the question of is that a moment where we start to come back together, or is that a moment where we retreat to our bunkers, and there's further polarization and bitterness? I think that's really a pivotal moment for the course of this administration. And the debate about unity, is it time for unity yet? Or do you need accountability before you can have unity? To me, I think that is what is going to play out in the next couple of months on that question will be really determinative of the course. And if you'll indulge me an anecdote, I was working in the Clinton administration at the end of that term. And I remember Vice President Gore delivering his concession address from his official office. And I was convinced not only had he won more votes from Americans, but in all likelihood won more votes from Floridians. And yet here he was conceding. And, the staff went down on an impromptu thing. And as he walked down the Navy steps, it was raining. We were applauding. He got in the car, drove out the gates, and then he was a private citizen. He was not coming back. And the power of that norm and the sacrifice that, the prioritization of the democracy and the legitimacy of the election results were more important to him than even the tremendous stakes of that election. And it's just, it's just so hard to understand how we were there 20 years ago and have arrived at this moment now.
Seth, over to you.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks. Those were excellent comments. I think it was very much worth going over the 5 minutes, so I'm glad we did that. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. On behalf of NAS, I would like to thank all our panelists, Susan, Julia, Peter, and James, and of course, thank you to Rachel Epstein for getting us started today. This recording, as I understand it, should be made available pretty quickly on the Korbel School's YouTube channel. There will be a cleaner version with closed captioning available probably sometime next week. Sadly, very few of us are likely to be attending inaugural balls tonight. However, some of this entertainment, as I understand it, will be televised, so I hope you get to enjoy some of that. Everyone stay safe and best to you all. Thank you for coming.